Hello listeners and welcome to the Montel Weekly podcast, bringing you energy matters in an informal setting. I'm Richard Sverrisson.
And I'm Anna Siwecka.
Today we're back in London and joined by Paolo Coghe and Laurence Walker. Paolo is an energy expert at consultancy Acousmatics. He's been covering these markets for years and years, both coal, gas, carbon, power, of course. Power is a key element of this. And Laurence has been with Montel for many years, and he's our coal editor. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And we've got lots to discuss today, but I thought we'd start off at looking at what's happening in the coal market, the current coal market dynamics. Prices have fallen to below 100. Will they ever rise above 100 again?
Well, that's a great question. Prices have gone above 100 in recent years, which was for me news, given the structural problems that coal markets have, especially for steam coal. So the first surprise is the prices went above 100. I'm less surprised that they've gone below 100. To answer your question, I'm not sure that they will ever go above 100 again, although never say never.
Mm-hmm. How low could they potentially? Could we go sub $50 a ton? Or
they could. It depends whether you want to look at it from a sustained low versus touching the low. Of course, they can touch lows that they've done. Most recently, I think in 2016, we had the lowest multi-year lows. So they can certainly go that way, that direction. But there will be, of course, support at levels not far from 50.
But you said you were surprised by...
Surprised because, indeed, if we look at the dynamics of prices for coal, we need to look at the cyclicality of such a commodity. And so we know that there are booms and busts, but we also need to look at what I call the structurality. So the fact that, at least in Europe, but in reality worldwide, coal has been phased out. Coal is no longer the primary, they used to say king coal, right? And king coal, I am afraid, is no more.
I think he's on his way out.
He's on his way out. However, it's quite resilient at the same time.
Of
right?
course. Yeah. We'll come back to that, I think, Paolo. But if we stay, I don't know, Laura, if you've got anything you'd like to bring up here about the cyclicality of these price movements.
Yes, I mean, again, I think what we've seen this year is quite a very sharp drop in prices. And, I mean, on the physical side, we've seen trades below, or at least around the 50 level. What you find at this level is that some of the producers become less interested in exporting at such levels. Some more expensive, I suppose. Some of the first to go would be the likes of the US, who, as we saw last year, hiked exports to Europe quite considerably.
So they'd stop exports rather than stop producing, or both?
Well, initially you'd see probably a slowdown in the exports. It's a longer thing to reduce your production. Also for some of the higher cost producers like the US, they prefer often not to just stop because it's expensive. You still have wages to pay, you have people there. The situation is perhaps different, for example, in Indonesia, where you have open pit mining. They can bring people in when they need people to produce the levels of coal you require, but certainly some of the more some of the producers, it's more difficult, and also it takes a while. So prices need to be maybe sustainably low for a while before you start seeing them taking those sort of decisions. That said, many of them have already taken such decisions, and we're going to see probably less of a surplus going forward in that respect. But there are also other things. So, for example, we've seen in the recent weeks, we're seeing some coal being even reloaded from European ports and shipped to Mediterranean destinations to the Far East. We're also seeing, I suppose, oil playing a role. We've had year-to-date highs for Brent.
Brent crude.
And obviously this has implications for the production costs, for logistic costs, and can, again, make production less viable for some producers.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm interested, Paolo, a little bit in this cyclicality of prices and of markets, commodities in particular. Could you go into some more details here? I mean, are we experiencing the downturn in the cycle before we go up again? I mean, what are the dynamics at play here?
When it comes to commodities, of course, especially coal, we always also have to think about sort of germane markets such as the foreign currency market, right, where we've seen that the dollar has increased or has appreciated globally in recent years, and also the ocean freight market. So these are important factors that should also be considered when looking at commodity prices. But to go back to your question about the cyclicality, again, as I said, boom, bust. And they alternate, and they are common to all commodities. One thing that is important to notice is that the boom periods tend to be sharper. Why? Because supply moves slowly, right? And so when there is demand that increases, and as we've seen for the past, couple of decades, China is really dictating what happens on coal in terms of the demand. And with the different regulations and always changing regulations in China, demand can shoot up quite sharply. And sometimes supply can be slow in response. And so this causes prices to boom up. Now, at the same time, once supply moves, and this would be supply in terms of coal, but also supply of dry bulk carriers, right? Or shortage, if that's the case, then there is a decline. And, one such example is that the fact that coal prices, after reaching peak values in the early 2010s, so 2011, 12, they went down for a period of about 5-6 years, only to go back up quite sharply, and now they're coming back down again.
So we're not quite bust, but we're not far away.
We're not bust, and then of course we cannot or must not forget the fact that the global economy is slowing down. Anywhere you look, you can look at the Eurozone. It grew by 2.2% in 2018, which was down, so a slowdown in the growth with respect to 2017. So that has a factor. Similarly, industrial production, again, global GDP has been slowing down, and these factors impact demand for coal.
Sure. I mean, Laura, you talked about oil a bit, and obviously that's also, we're at year highs or 5-month highs. 6 months, even close to 6-month highs. But how, in terms of other commodities like gas, for example, how does that play a role in the coal market dynamics here, Paolo? Could you say something about that?
Of course. If you're looking at power generation, so coal as a fuel for power generation in Europe, clearly its main competitor is natural gas. And what we have had in the past few years was high gas prices relative to coal because there was the Asian LNG pool. So the LNG was going into Asia, where Asian buyers were ready to pay a premium for LNG to be dispatched there. Now, the reverse has happened where now this premium is no longer available. In Asia, LNG has come into Europe, and gas prices in general in Europe have been cheap, and that obviously favors gas generation. That's one of the elements. Not to be forgotten the fact that there is legislation in Europe, obviously looking at CO2, the coming into play of the market stability reserve.
In the carbon market.
In the carbon market, of course. And that means that there is a strong disincentive to burn coal. And so there again, a lower demand for a given supply.
Sure. So these are all factors all at play.
And I think that's, again, as you can see, even looking at the prices, for coal, API2 prices, we reached, we rose above 100 in early October last year, and it's been heading downwards since. You can look at the gas prices, and they kind of mirror it. If you look at the sort of MBP, TTF prices, we're seeing highs again in October, tailing off now. And I think especially the API2 has become very sort of intrinsically linked with gas, more so perhaps than we've seen sometimes in recent years when the markets looked to Asia for directions, looked for other particular drivers. But because of this absolute oversupply in LNG, in gas that we have at the moment, it's really kind of dominated the whole market, and now the moves we're seeing are very closely linked and
linked to gas to developments.
So we see an upturn or a downturn. They tend to move quite closely at the present, and obviously, as Paolo mentioned, the dark spreads are pretty poor. for a loss at the moment.
The profits from generating power from coal. Yeah.
Exactly. I mean, some in Germany are barely scraping $1 at these sort of levels. So.
But I'm just wondering. It's interesting how it all relates to other commodities and specifically and to sort of cycles, commodities, boom and bust cycles. But isn't also, a big factor here is what China decides. I mean, the policy front from China. So China decides to import less or import more, and prices move accordingly. Isn't that also a major factor here?
Most definitely, and that's what I was hinting at before when I mentioned sort of China and its regulations impacting demand sharply in the short term. Right? They have that ability. It's such a large market that a regulation that prevents or disincentivizes its internal consumers from importing coal is going to have a reverberating effect in the whole of the transatlantic trade.
Yeah, for certainly for gas as well. We're seeing that in LNG and of course similar moves there.
And of course, yes. And if I may add, this also comes into play in terms of longer term trends where, as I mentioned, there is decarbonization. That's the sort of global goal over to longer periods, say to 2040. It also means that there are increasing amounts of regulation, even in emerging Asian countries, that try to, once again, disincentivize coal use or make it more expensive to use coal. So all of these factors are summing up in a sort of structural way, and they don't spell a bright future for coal.
King Coal heading for the exit, potentially, certainly by 2040. Laurie, anything?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, it's history. I think also what's also perhaps interesting at the moment is that the market is in contango, so we're seeing prices further out, more supportive, which suggests, either that somewhere along the line they are expecting some sort of a bit more demand or less supply, or a combination of the two. Possibly, we may see some more buying from China going forward this year, which again could be part of the reason. Also, a lot of it is obviously down to the fact we just got such heavy supply in Europe at the prompt end of the curve that it's not, it's just bringing the market into such a structure. But yes, while obviously the long-term outlook is pretty grim in terms of demand for coal, it's there are certainly some, it's not going to be a straight downward dive, as it were.
No, it's not going to go off a cliff. But some people have been sounding the death knell for coal for many years now, and it's still a vital part of the energy mix.
Well, we've seen in the UK, for example, in news this weekend over Easter, they had, the longest ever period without using coal since the Industrial Revolution. I mean, this is something we're going to see more and more across Europe and eventually, further afield. But it's certainly a fuel which is relied on still by a lot of countries. Some in Europe still.
Absolutely. I mean, that's the direction of travel, clearly. But the pace at which we get there is obviously determined by many factors. And my question to you, Paolo, is what's driving this direction of travel for coal? Is it policy initiatives such as the carbon price floor in the UK, or market-based mechanisms such as the European Trading Scheme, or a combination of the both? Because as Laurence just mentioned, we've had some of the longest periods without any coal-fired generation in the UK for hundreds of years, the lowest for hundreds of years. So,
well, it's a little bit, if you think of it in terms of the sea, and you have tide, and you have wave, and you have ripple, right? So at different levels of analysis, you can drill into the causes. And so some of the big driver is global decarbonization. And that's so that's the tide, right? You also have the waves, and the waves have to do more with what's actually happening in terms of global supply and demand and the transatlantic trade, what's happening with foreign currency exchange, what's happening with freight, and so on and so forth. And the ripple is what Laurence was hinting at earlier when he's talking about, for example, the shape of the curve, and specifically, for example, now that the curve is in contango, we see a lot of restocking at utilities. So what that tells me is that there is no premium on the prompt, right? No premium on the short term. Utilities are taking this opportunity because, of course, coal is on the way out, but it's not quite out yet, even in Europe. And they're taking the opportunity to buy at relatively low prices. Now, we we may have a repeat of what happened, as I was mentioning, between 2011 and 2016, whereas coal prices in the prompt kept falling down from above 100 to below 50, the curve for the longest time was still in contango. So that was sort of giving hope that there would be more demand in the future, and yet prices kept sliding down up until the point where it became really, really unprofitable for producers to produce at those low levels, which then meant that the rebalancing has occurred, and demand again is catching up with supply that has paused, right? And that you could see this effect by the forward curve flattening initially, and then switching into backwardation as prices started increasing again, right? So again, premium on the short term, but not a bright future in terms of demand in the future.
I mean, you've done a lot of analysis on, for example, on the impact. At least I think you have, Paolo. I think
I've done a lot. I've done a lot of analysis on many things.
Yeah, perfect. So I think, in particular, on environmental legislation and rules, I'm thinking of the Industrial Emissions Directive and potentially the impact there on old coal-fired generation.
Yes.
I know it was you and your partner Gerald Wynne who covered this in quite a lot of detail and said potentially we could lose substantial amounts of coal-fired generation in Europe because of these rules. So that's where the rules of policies biting in, isn't it?
Correct. That's certainly what our research notes were pushing for. Anyways, although then we're starting to touch a slightly different commodity, which is lignite, which is part of the problem, but there is no doubt that recent approval of air pollution regulation, so up until now we've talked about the long-term goals of decarbonization, but air pollution regulation has actually put the impact right here, right now for coal, where existing power plants have to make a decision on whether to comply or not, and compliance is expensive, especially since it happens in a context where many countries, Netherlands is but one example, have decided and put legislation into place to phase coal out. One of the most important examples of this is if you look at the Netherlands, brand new coal-fired units that came online in 2015 will be retired by 2029. Okay, so coal is not a good business from this point of view, and if you want to look into what that means for the commodity, obviously less demand. Which brings me to the long-term perspectives for coal, right? Even though we may have ups and downs in terms of prices, the long-term perspective is not bright because there isn't that strong pull from emerging economies anymore. Once China is gone, India is the big hope. And then we have
the hope is in the hope for coal demand.
The hope for coal demand, right? The fact that
because for others that wouldn't be a hope.
Most definitely.
Certainly the people camped out here at Oxford Circus, that would not be a hope. So that would be a worst case scenario.
Correct.
Just to put that in the context. Anything to add to that? I mean, you're seeing, certainly we've talked about the clear direction in which we're going. So Netherlands, but how about Poland? I think Poland's quite an interesting example here. What are the options for Poland?
Poland, well, again, they're
Anna's home land.
Yes, yeah. Well, I mean, it's obviously it's a country which is so heavily reliant on coal. It's a difficult. It's going to be difficult for them to get away from it. In the UK, where as we were saying, we can quite, we can ramp up wind power generation, we can ramp up nuclear, all these sort of things. Since Poland is so heavily dependent on not only its domestic coal, also imported coal, and I'm not sure I can give a clear answer on how, because I don't think they can solve it.
You don't have a crystal ball either, Laurie. But
I think what is sort of interesting again is the levels of coal. I mean, they completely over-imported coal last year, and so
19 million tonnes.
Yes, yeah. So, I mean, as a result of that, that was obviously, something supportive in that way. It's also adding to the weight this year, because although we tend to look at the stocks, maybe the ARA ports, we look at the stocks at German plants. Obviously, if Poland's not going to import, several million tons that it did import last year, that's going to have an impact as well. So it's, even if it's not clear what its legislation is going to do, how its future is in terms of demand, in the near term at least, it's certainly continuing to play quite an important role in pricing in Europe. And it will do certainly this year, if not next year as well.
But then you mentioned also the coal stocks at German utilities. Barges couldn't actually physically get to the plants by river, by using the waterways. So what are they doing this year? I mean, there's certain areas of Europe where they haven't seeing that amount of rainfall again.
Well, yes, yeah. I mean, certainly there is a risk, and perhaps a high risk of a similar occurrence. I think what's different, several things. Firstly, perhaps they're better prepared this year. Some of the utilities are at least stocking up a little bit earlier. They're booking rail capacity instead of barge. I know the rail operators, DB Cargo, for example, is laying on more trains than perhaps they would do in the past. But the other thing is the market's very different to how it was last year. So we came out of a very, very harsh winter. Stocks were already low. Gas stocks were low. This year, there's so much gas, again, as we're going back into that even if there is a shortage of coal, it shouldn't roll. It shouldn't be such an issue. So I think purely because the market's very different this year, we won't see the same sort of issues, the same sort of utilities announcing disruptions to power output, because there will be alternatives.
How low did the River Rhine fall last year? Was it 40 centimetres?
Well, we got down to 25 centimetres, which I think was, again, the lowest since 1880. So it was very low. I mean, but again, the barges have got flat bottoms. They can still go through, but they have to reduce the loads they carry so much. I mean, in terms, they were carrying a third of capacity, sometimes less. And as a result of that, the barge operators charge a premium. So the costs skyrocket for anyone who wants to bring coal in, and they have to pay up for it. So although we don't see any stock data for the German plants, it's confidential. Hearsay is that stocks are probably fairly good, especially if the port stocks are anything to go by.
A big part of the political landscape in the UK over the past week or 2 weeks has been the Extinction Rebellion. That's part of a very public rebellion or a movement to urge the politicians to do something about climate change, coming from the school kids rebellion and also what's happening now on the streets and bridges of London. Do you think this is going to exert more and more pressure on politicians to maybe speed up the coal exit? You mentioned the Netherlands. And in other countries such as Germany, which Laurie's talking about. Although obviously in the UK there's a big push, but the UK's already gone a long way.
Correct. I think it's when it comes down to countries where coal and again lignite have such an important or play such an important role, there has to be a political solution that's not just an economics-based solution, and so this may actually lengthen the time, because of the usual arguments about jobs and about the regional economies. So yes, protests are important, but there also is the political and, we must admit it, lobbying side of things, where it's sort of a countervailing force to these protests. I guess the protests get a lot of the news, but the economic power of the utilities gets a lot of the politicians' ears, perhaps.
Okay, maybe they listen to them more than maybe to some people on the street.
And so one also needs to be realistic in terms of how much acceleration there can be. The United Kingdom has done things well in terms of sort of starting early. The coal legacy has been shed by the UK ahead of many other countries. Countries like Germany and Poland in particular are quite a bit slower in that, but there are reasons.
Of course. So do you expect, there's a huge pressure, and I know that there's the Coal Exit Commission in Germany is, proposing changes to the law. I mean, how quickly do you expect things to move in Germany in this direction?
I don't have a strong view on this, so I cannot say how quickly. The one thing I can say is that sometimes these things seem to move very slowly, and then there is a sudden acceleration. I see it a little bit less likely in Poland, because if you look at it, there is a very large state or partially state-owned utility that, as far as I could see, does not have a plan B. There's plan A, which is coal and lignite, and they're doubling down, and they have the sort of agreement and help in a way from the government. Now, of course, Poland does not live in isolation. Poland is part of the EU, so I can see these dynamics continuing for where there's a push and a pull.
How does this all play out on wholesale power prices? And we've talked a little about the pricing curves for coal, but how does this play out for European wholesale prices for the next...
For power prices, again, what we have seen in the past few years is that prices had gotten to a low level, a level that made many large utilities unprofitable, and then prices have recovered from those lows, and it may not seem much, but a difference of, say, 5 euros per megawatt hour will have a very strong impact on the bottom line of utilities. So price recovery may not seem impressive if we move from 40 to 45, but at the same time, that can have a big difference on the bottom line of utilities. And so utilities that would not have survived, let's say, sub 40 or sub 30, even when we reach those levels, they will not exactly thrive with current prices, obviously, once again, keeping in mind the relatives of price of coal, price of gas. But it is better. So we shouldn't expect prices to jump up.
But slowly kind of move up in that. Yeah,
but slowly move up, yes.
And is this cyclical as well, or is this...
Of course, and of course power has its own price, but we must not forget that the power price is a derivative of the price of the fuels that are burned to obtain the power when we're looking at thermal generation. So again, the interplay of coal versus gas.
I think that's quite interesting. I think certainly coal plants also set some of the price in the Nordic region, even though coal is on the way out. I mean, when do you expect that to change? I mean, when could the gas plants be the price setting? No, I mean, maybe this is hard to say, really. It just surprises me that, in a region where there is not so much coal, it still kind of sets the price of the price of power. It's intriguing for me.
It depends on what the marginal unit is, and of course, once again, we must not forget interplay of imports and exports across countries. We have not touched on it, but another important dynamic of this is the fact that when we talk about generating power by burning coal, we're talking about certain types of units, which are usually large units and not exactly flexible units. And so then those are the problems where if you look at an average price, you get an answer that may be even reassuring a bit. But then when you look at the actual operation of these plants and how much they can make in terms of returns, the flexibility, they cannot offer flexibility. And so therefore there are elements of that are covered by the renewables.
No, absolutely. I mean, what do you think, Laurie, in terms of the drivers going forward now? I mean, what are the areas which we should be looking forward into in terms of looking at in terms of the price setting dynamics? I mean, what are the key elements now for the remainder of this year and into next year?
Well, certainly for this year, it's going to continue to be. Well, gas is going to play a key role again in Europe, as always for coal, Asia. So China, depends what happens in China. If Three Gorges Dam clonks out, then suddenly you've got 22 gigs which have to be replaced. So you can never really quite be sure what happens there. And obviously on the policy side, what sort of policy they're likely to bring in. Weather, do we get El Nino this year? Will that affect output? I think there's latest forecasts are sort of 70% likelihood. So that's, I think, triple the usual likelihood. And this, again, can have both beneficial and negative impacts on production, depending on where you are.
How does that happen then, Lauren? Could you
Well,
explain
it tends to result in drier weather. So, for example, in Australia, you may have less flood-related issues or less heavy rains causing problems. But, for example, Colombia, you may have productions with you may have problems with dust, maybe high levels of dust, which can restrict production. So, yeah, it's it depends. That can play out in a very different way as well. So yeah, whether in Europe, whether in China, what kind of are we going to get a warm, hot summer? Are we going to get a mild one? Are we going to get unlikely to have a cold one, but these things are all going to play into it. Yeah, as always with coal, there's always a wild card which jumps out from somewhere. I say China, weather, and gas, probably three big ones at the moment.
Well, these surprises that Laurence is mentioning, they usually hit in one direction, right? You're never going to have a surprise where you all of a sudden have much less supply unless some event happens, right? So usually surprises tend to drive prices up.
Does geopolitics have a role here at all? I mean, they've been talking, talk of a trade war, potentially the China-US issues. Could that play in?
Most definitely. And one of the ways that would play in is through FX markets, where, again, if we look a little bit back, let's say to 2016, 2016 here in Europe means Brexit. And so what Brexit did is it triggered a move towards safety, and safety for currencies means dollar. And so that meant dollar strength. In 2017, what we have seen is the US Federal Reserve increasing rates. And now to bring it to just last year, what we see again is US protectionism. So once again, questions about trade and trade deals or disruptions of trade that have once again led to an appreciation, global appreciation of the US dollar. This has an impact on coal prices since coal is priced in US dollars.
Sure.
So why we're not talking about Russia when it's such a big coal market?
Russia certainly is a very, very big one, and I think that's also an interesting point regarding supply. For example, looking at past winter, or we've actually seen an interesting thing in terms of climatic changes as well. So, for example, 10 years ago, every winter there was everyone would look at the ice situation in the Baltic and think, what's going to happen? Is there going to be thick ice? If there's thick ice, it can disrupt the shipping. We had stories of at least one vessel, I think it was biomass actually, but at least one vessel which took 5 weeks to sail from St. Petersburg to Helsinki. This now is not happening. They're having less ice in the Baltic, so supply issues are less of an issue. The icebreakers are more efficient. On top of that, Russia has invested quite heavily in its export infrastructure, so there's a new port at Taman on the Sea of Azov in the south, which is coming online this year. It's already started loading vessels. It's supposed to become more. Well, it could reach up to 25 million tons a year, they say. I don't know if they'll be able to fill that capacity, but it's certainly a sign that if Russia wants to get coal out, it will. And it's still a very, very important supplier. It supplies maybe 30%, 35% of Germany's coal.
What about, because the criticism has always been, so it's very cheap, but their infrastructure, the coal transport infrastructure in Russia is falling apart, essentially. Mm-hmm. And so, that hasn't happened yet because they've been exporting and they've increased their exports. But is that a threat still?
It seems to be. It is always a threat, and there's certainly that the infrastructure, so the rail, especially, they used to have huge problems with bottlenecks on the rail capacity. They have expanded this. There do seem to have been improvements there. Also, even things just at the ports, for example, they seem to have been investing more in facilities for warming the carriages when they arrive to get the ice. So in the past, they had problems unloading because they had ice freezing the coal. This is less of an issue now. So they have been quite. It's always very, very hard to get a straight answer from any of the operators on what's happening, and it's hard to get clear information. But certainly, they opened new sections of rail. They've opened a new, I think, a 2-mile tunnel or something last year near the Kuzbass region. So they are doing things, and like I said earlier, the sort of disruptions to logistics, which used to be quite a key driver for API2 prices, for global prices maybe, we're kind of hearing less of them now.
Paolo and Laurie, thank you very much for joining the Montel Weekly podcast this week. We look forward to having you on board again to see how things then played out over the course of the year and see whether our analysis was on the ball or not, as it were.
For the latest news from the energy markets, go to our Twitter at Montel News and follow us also on our website at Montel News. Be sure to subscribe to our podcast. You can find us on Spotify and also on iTunes. This is all for today's episode. Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye.